Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's Sifted Talks in partnership with Vanta. I'm Kai, a journalist at Sifted, and we're here today to talk about building compliant AI systems. Because as AI becomes deeply embedded in product and growth strategies, startups face a critical challenge: how to build intelligent systems that are not only effective, but also safe, secure, and built to scale responsibly. From data governance to explainability, startups must navigate a growing set of expectations around transparency, bias, and safety. So, how do you embed trust and compliance into your AI stack from the start? What does good governance look like when you're building your team and product? And how can you avoid costly rebuilds down the line? We're going to be asking those questions and more over the next hour. We're going to be taking audience questions throughout, so please just submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. These can be upvoted and we're going to discuss the most popular. But without further ado, let's introduce the panelists. I am joined by Meri Williams, Chief Technology Officer at corporate spend platform Pleo, Lawrence Jones, engineer at incident response startup incident.io, Dan Lifshits, co-founder, COO, and CPO at AI property management marketplace Dwelly, and Faisal Khan, governance, risk, and compliance expert at compliance automation platform Vanta. And I want to start by getting a sense of the lay of the land right now. So, how has compliance changed over the past few years with the rise of AI? Maybe Faisal, you can kick us off. What's shifted?
Yeah, for sure. I'd say I'd position it as more of a growth in terms of the different concepts that we look about in the compliance world overall. When new domains arose, data privacy, data security, you kind of saw a similar pattern follow suit. Security industry standards like 27001 came about. Privacy 27701 was that extension, but then you had regulations like GDPR, the CCPA, and things like that. When you start to introduce new technology into the world, and that technology may pose specific risks to specific organizations and groups of people in society, it's only natural for us to need to come out with, okay, how do we best roll out some of those deployments across the world? So that's why we're starting to see industry standards like 42001. 42001 is the best way I like to put it to customers is think of it as 27001, but on an AI focus. How do you build an AI governance program for yourself? You have the EU AI Act, which is governing how specific types of risk-based systems apply to organizations and what their responsibilities are for those use and deployments of such systems. And you kind of see the adoption across the world as well in a very similar pattern. So I think if we take it at a much higher level, it's the rise of new technology just kind of implicitly and inherently warrants the need to have some level of governance in place to safeguard its use overall.
What are you noticing, Lawrence? I mean, you work with a number of different startups. What are you noticing in like the different issues that they now bring to you?
I think the key difference, at least that I've been noticing with AI, is this technology shift is happening at a rate that I've never seen anything happen before. So adoption of cloud technologies, for example, was honestly just a lot slower as it progressed through the industry. So you've kind of got this conflict at the moment where almost every company on the planet is trying to figure out how to leverage this new technology, either by building things themselves or by using products that have embedded AI deeply into their workflows. But everyone is trying to, at the same time, figure out how to do this safely and how to get assurances from the people that they're using with these AI features that actually they're built responsibly and that they're performing very well. There's also this really strange complexity that I've written about before, which is that building a prototype AI feature is actually super easy. And it's very hard to distinguish the difference between a prototype AI feature that like looks very impressive and looks like it does a good job, and one that is actually doing a good job. Honestly, it's extremely highly contextually dependent and kind of actually mentally taxing to look at a lot of these AI flows and try and pick apart whether or not you've been handed like AI slop from a product, or if it's actually doing the job and it's got enough thinking behind it and it's been tuned as a system and the people who have been building it have been tuning it so that it produces reliable results. So yeah, we work with companies of all sorts of scales. So from like Netflix, for example, who use us for incident response, to much smaller companies. So we get kind of the two different angles of like very mature and AI first companies at the larger scale of things, and also much younger companies. The only thing that's consistent is that everyone really wants to figure out how to use this technology, and everyone is kind of making it up as they go along on how they can do that responsibly and get the assurances that they need from people. So the stuff that we're seeing is mostly customers coming along and pressing us on, how are you building this thing internally? Can you give us assurances about the quality control you're putting into it, and how do you float that type of evaluation through the product experience so customers can trust the sort of thing that your product is outputting.
Meri, Pleo have been around for some time now. You're kind of one of the veterans in the European startup scene. How have you gone about, I guess, initially, where have you looked to apply AI? And what are the areas that you need to be aware of compliance around that? And how have you built compliant AI systems on top of those that didn't used to be AI? Looks like we may have just lost Meri there. That's okay. We'll come back. Meri,
Apologies. I had an incident of my own, which was that my cleaner knocked the router over and I lost internet for a moment. So I completely missed your question, Kai. I apologize.
that is okay. I can repeat that, no problem. Whereabouts are you applying AI to? What are the areas that you need to be very aware of in that compliance? And how have you built compliant AI systems on top of those that didn't used to be AI?
Yeah, so I think we're in a really interesting position. We have a lot of information from our customers about their spend. And one of the things that AI can be really helpful with is to analyze that and try to give some kind of optimization suggestions or opportunities to make smarter decisions. We've got a feature in beta right now where every time somebody spends, we go and check the the expenses policy of the company and basically go like, is this in line with it or not? And that's something where you obviously want to get it right. You don't want to freak somebody out that they've spent the company's money in a way that they shouldn't have done. But as Lawrence was just saying earlier, it's really difficult to get high quality and consistent results. And so we've had to take some interestingly different approaches in terms of the level of confidence that we've got and what we show to the user and so on. But we've also had to be really careful that we're not leaking any data that we shouldn't do into any of these models, right? And I think that when a lot of the models first came out, there wasn't necessarily a whole bunch of safety that you could give it some inputs and not have that absorbed into the greater knowledge base of the LLM. And I think that those safety rails have been improved by the providers a lot in the last year and a bit. But we're also just having to be very careful, because we're financially regulated, that we're not accidentally giving any kind of financial advice or anything like that. And so we're very much taking the approach of trying to not silo, but sort of contextualize down exactly what task we're giving the AI, and be really careful that it's limited to just what is okay for it to do, and not overreaching in any way. And on the one hand, we already had a product development process that was very aware of GDPR and the regulation and all of these other things. And so we've got product teams that are quite well versed in that. And this has just been an extra layer of complexity that we've had to layer on. And I think part of it is about that complexity. And part of it is that it's just quite new in software development to have a non-deterministic aspect to your system, right? Like, almost all traditional forms of code, you could get consistent results every time, and this new approach, you can't guarantee that you're going to get the same result if you give the same input. And so we're having to do a lot of evaluation and different types of testing and different types of monitoring to make sure that things are working well.
Dan, Dwelly have been around for a few years now. You've always been an AI native company. How has that informed your compliance processes?
First off, thanks for having me. A pleasure to be with you guys. I think kind of you're right. I think that there is like some inherent difference into kind of AI native, AI first versus the companies that kind of started applying AI kind of later down the road. I mean, I have to say, kind of, I think that being kind of a bit of a newer company here, I think that we kind of appeared kind of end of 2023 and being kind of comparatively a smaller business kind of for now as compared to kind of some of the other kind of guys in the room. I think that we obviously coming also from the angle trying to be kind of quite frugal and kind of reasonable in terms of kind of allocation of costs, right? And meaning that kind of you inherently don't need to be building kind of a huge kind of compliance safety teams in the beginning, because effectively I think that kind of your CTO and product team and key of the kind of engineers effectively kind of are these people themselves, right? And you're just applying kind of reasonable judgment to try to just control kind of the ground. But kind of our business effectively kind of significantly is all about automating existing kind of very admin, mundane, kind of human-centric workflows. And I think that this is exactly the bread and butter application of kind of AI in the modern era, especially kind of highly contextual communication centric AI, because effectively kind of all that you do is you have quite predefined kind of prescriptive process, and then it's pretty easy for you to know if the thing's moving along this process or if there are some deviations. And I think that when we talk about kind of building some safety about kind of AI and our design flows, primarily it has to do about kind of being able to kind of to track and recognize when something has happened not as planned. And kind of I think the key for that goes back into kind of just deeply designing kind of your flows and understanding effectively kind of what are the inputs and quite prescriptive outputs that you expect at every stage, and then kind of learning to recognize when there was a deviation from what you expected and then kind of bringing it up to attention. I think that's primarily kind of what we're using as a kind of framework, how to recognize problems kind of in the outputs of AI. And I mean, hey, this can be kind of effectively finding for these deviations can be done pretty well by AI itself as well. So I think like AI controlling AI to some extent, I think in that regard works pretty well for us for now, at least.
Yeah, and I also wanted to just kind of do a top level here too, because across all the feedback we're hearing, we're seeing a lot of not only like different systems doing different things with the use case of AI, but the types of protections that we think about in testing, it's kind of all rooted in use of data, right? And how this data is going to be used, and that kind of informs how you should treat some of those systems inputs and outputs. I want to coming back to some of that root question you asked, Kai, about like the industry at large, how we see how we're seeing that kind of change overall in the compliance space. I think we at top level, the industry and AI has actually been around for quite a bit. It's just about how AI is now being used and further developed and refined and the ways it's going to be used, right? If we think about just 1900s for a second, the Eliza chatbot, the self-driving car, those concepts are all applications of AI. Heck, the Mars rover is an application of AI. Siri and Alexa, right? Things like that, where these concepts have been around for quite a bit. It's just about the deepening of those use cases across just frankly worldwide expansion into different systems, different data sets. And that's what encourages the use of AI to help streamline and further optimize existing programs. And then because of that, and because of that worldwide expansion, you now see guardrails start to come out. You start to say, hey, okay, well, before it was just X, but now it's becoming a much bigger and larger thing that we probably need a guardrail. And that's why you see these standards and compliance regulations and things like that, where they just help with that general management of proliferation, if you will.
Yeah, for sure. I'd like to come on to the kind of like regulatory standards in a little bit. I think it's really interesting as we can like look to the future, the kinds of things that is going to be, or the kinds of regulations that are going to be impacting startups. Dan, you mentioned a really interesting point about cost. Early stage startups, finances and resources are really finite. What do you need to spend money on from the beginning? Like, what do you need to focus on?
I think that talking about AI governance, one of the key things trying to achieve the 80/20, I think it's primarily just like about having a proper kind of, in a way, checklists integrated into your product to just understand, kind of to provide some guardrails of how you kind of using kind of the data effectively and the kind of inputs and outputs of that. So it's like effectively just knowing very, very well effectively kind of where and what kind of data sources you're using, number one. I mean, which models, obviously different models work best for different purposes. I think that a lot of things you can do to kind of try to run an A/B test parallel of a few models and just seeing kind of which output provides kind of the best. And I think that kind of number three is super important, having kind of on one end, whenever some potential output to the end user might be kind of not exactly something that they might have expected to see. I think that number one is just like elaborating to the users why kind of this happened, kind of what was the thing behind the scenes that kind of made it such. And second, try to provide a feedback loop back again. Again, either it can be kind of integrated internally, or it can be giving a users even an opportunity to like flag errors or some biases or some other things, because I think that again, if you explain well what is happening kind of out there, then kind of there would be an opportunity to kind of to do that. And I think frankly, kind of in terms of the 80-20 for the early stage company, that probably would be it, because I think that no one expects kind of whatever 100-page kind of responsible AI application report whenever you're kind of Series A, Series B kind of company. I think that everyone is kind of being reasonable here. I think talking about some anecdotes and kind of some funny examples. So kind of in our specific workflow case, for example, one of the applications of AI is like, imagine you're a tenant, you're applying for the property kind of potentially, and obviously kind of how it's done today in the real world is that like someone sitting in a branch on a high street kind of picks up the phone, starts asking you quite standardized questions about kind of effectively to fill in the data of yourself into kind of some sort of CRM and kind of pass you by questionnaire about like how many pets you have, how many kids, whom you're moving in, kind of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that this is kind of one of ideal applications of AI, obviously, right? Kind of on one end to answer all potential tenants' questions, and on the other end, collect and absorb some of the information that we need kind of from the people. But I think that's exactly kind of, it's quite predeterministic input and output we expect, but equally kind of things can kind of take turns and go wrong. Like, for example, I think that some tenants realizing, hey, it seems like I'm chatting with AI, start asking us questions, for example, something like, can you give me the best pizza recipe, for example? And we're like, hey, I mean, that's not exactly what we designed it for. I mean, and I think we kind of, it also comes only with flagging up these examples, right? Talking back to kind of having the flags or giving users an ability to kind of to flag up some kind of errors and bias. And I think that then you kind of nail it down back into kind of, hey, actually kind of we're a property assistant. I mean, we can provide you a recipe of the best margarita in town, but we'll much better provide you kind of some advice about kind of where best to live in the city. So I think you can kind of nail it back again, but I think that it's kind of dealing with this unknown unknowns that I think one of the most problematic things that you need to kind of learn to do. Again, talking about our use case, where our use case is just kind of very practical kind of application layer of AI into real world kind of a mix of like real world operations that kind of get effectively merged with technologies. Again, in the examples, I'm sure of like Pleo, Incident, and Vanta, it might be kind of very different applications. So happy to pass the word to the guys to kind of share more.
Yeah, I just want to plus one a lot of what Dan's saying here. It's also rooted in how we think about explainability and transparency as broader concepts, and just making a lot of that information known. So, hey, how is this AI bit that you're going to use as part of maybe my product offering or the service provider offering going to work? What are the do's? What are the don'ts? And being very clear about, okay, hey, these are the intended use cases of it. You can ask me for the pizza recipe. I may give you a semi-decent answer, but you probably don't want to ask me for advice on how to create a pizza, but you probably want to ask me advice on how to do these things, and this is what we'll control. So it comes back to this broader point of like, okay, well, how do you communicate some of these things? And you can use a combination of things, whether it's a page on your website, it can be part of some broader agreements and contract addendums. It could be trust centers like what Vanta provides to be able to illustrate and communicate some of those aspects. And using the components at not only the external comm level, but then taking it back into the platform or service that you're providing as a product, and saying, hey, like there's this AI component that you can turn on and you can use, but note that these are the following things that are going to happen. And if you want to learn more, like here's how you should approach it. It's adding more detail of explanation to go in and hopefully guide the user to be able to properly use it for the tasks that it's associated with.
Kai, you asked about costs just then. And I wonder whether or not did you have a specific theme on those? Because like costs and cost control with AI is actually kind of huge, and it is as yet pretty pretty unknown how to go about it. Was there a theme that you were looking for there?
Yeah, look, feel free to pick it up. Share your
Yeah.
thoughts.
No,
What are
well,
what
yeah.
are you noticing at the moment?
So I guess we're not as early stages, Dwelly, but we like adopting AI and trying to figure out how to put that into the product when it entirely changes your calculation on COGS, and how you think about this from a business and how you think about it from a pricing perspective. And actually, honestly, even from a development angle, has been quite challenging. So like just in terms of like practical things that we do is we meter all of our AI interactions that we have within the product. So we collect them both at like the prompts that we're running and also the purpose with which we're running those prompts, so that you can slice and dice our AI usage across many different providers by, are we background processing these for people, and how does that background processing then enable certain other features? But you also get like different types of usage, which is very different from how most companies have been thinking about SaaS before. So like each one of our chatbot interactions, for example, they can range from like a couple of cents to process to, in some cases, anywhere like 30 cents or even higher in some cases. So trying to figure out how to price that and package that within a product and kind of bring that to market is something that I don't think that many people have figured out right now. And there's a lot of broader discussion about how you're kind of selling the value of AI. Are you selling it as are you trying to change the way that you do your pricing as a SaaS? Are you trying to change from being a seat-based sort of product, or are you trying to sell more of like a value outcome? Because obviously the more that you use the product, the more that you're actually going to be paying on these AI fees, and that does actually end up playing into how you want to price and package your product. But yeah, it's been really hard for us to figure out. And then you have also the development angle. You've got developers who are wanting to run backtests and evals, and that does drive up some cost internally. Honestly, that for us is not as high at all as the usage that we're getting from our customers. But you even then, as like a B2B company, suddenly you go from most of your customers are using you, and you can imagine that you have a B2B customer, and then a B2C customer, and both of those people previously would have approximately the same amount of incidents if they had the same headcount with our system, so the usage was the same. But with AI anyway, when we want to go process, for example, all of their telemetry data, suddenly B2C has a totally different cost footprint than the B2B company does. So you're going from a product that before was seat-based and like the pricing agreed, to how do you now price it? Because actually this is very complicated to do because your customers are suddenly in a very different region depending on the type of customer that they are. So that is to say that, like, honestly, the best thing that we found is trying to make sure that you meter all the costs, you expose this in like a useful dashboard and everything else that you do with it, but also bringing developers really close to every interaction and how much it costs. So feedback loops, like tagging all of the AI interactions with costs and putting those in the debug UI so that developers are really close to it, and then just sending like a daily report of how much did you spend yesterday, watching for spikes and then digging into them. But yeah, it's really hard. I don't know if anyone else has been hitting against these challenges.
Lawrence,
Absolutely.
I'm curious. Can I ask a quick question? Just curious, how kind of big is the team that works on AI application kind of an incident, and how big is the total engineering team?
So the total engineering team now is approaching about 40 people, I think. The number that we have on AI now is, I think, probably like 13, 14, but growing fairly fast. Actually, honestly, the reason it's not growing faster is because these AI systems are very hard to figure out how to scale the headcount on them. Like building a scalable function that can work on a system like this when it's all so interconnected, and you're kind of building the tooling to make it safe to work on one part of the system without impeding another, is really, really difficult. Otherwise, we would have another 20, 30 people on this thing. Meri, you came in just then.
It was actually just around the cost point, because I
Yeah.
completely agree that it changes a lot of your your cost of providing the service. But the companies that we're selling to, and our own companies, nobody's started to think or budget that way yet. So
Nope.
everybody's
Not yet.
thinking that things scale with the number of employees or with the complexity.
Mhm.
not thinking that it's going to scale with usage. It used to be a great thing if your product was being used every day. Maybe now it's a little more double-edged than it used to be. And I think it's a really interesting dynamic, particularly for SaaS businesses. There's been a couple of startups around talking about more sort of usage-based pricing and that kind of thing until now, and they didn't really take off. But I wonder if AI is the thing that's going to like shove that into the mainstream, because you can't afford to have a cookie cutter approach anymore, unless you end up like like gyms do, where they rely on there being a whole bunch of people paying for a membership that don't ever turn up. I don't think we want that for our customers. It doesn't feel like a great value.
Agreed.
Bad for them to be paying and not using these features. But yeah, they're increasingly expensive. And some of the very minute differences and little choices that you can make can then have like a very big impact on how the cost scales.
Yeah, I almost think of its synergy like as a cost concept, very similar to how I think about SIMs. Like the more you use the SIM, the more you log the data in the SIM, the more your potential cost of using that SIM can go up at like magnitudes of level, right? If you log everything, you report everything, you monitor everything, you're gonna end up with a very hefty bill. I'm actually really curious from the team we have here, like when we start thinking about the costs at that micro level and saying, hey, like, X type of interaction might induce Y cost, Z interaction might induce A cost. Um, how much discovery is done on the actual features and the use of those features for specific use cases? And the reason I ask is because in the SIM concept, right, you have to be very targeted and like, what are you trying to log? Why are you logging it? And you kind of go through that same level of thinking of, okay, well, I log these things because they impact X type of business operation, the system operation. I'm very curious if there are similar talk tracks when we think about choosing to use AI in specific features in specific ways, and if you guys had any insights to share there.
Yeah, I think I probably have the most relevant on this. It's like, so we're building an AI SRE product. The idea of it is that it should sit in your incident response platform, and it should be able to do a ton of the work that your SRE might do when they first turn up in an incident, to go collate all of these different data sources together and quickly identify and narrow down, like, oh, actually it's that code change, and by the way, I've got a code fix for it here. Here's a PR that fixes the problem. Do you want to
Yeah.
go review it? What this means is, like, the way that we have gone and built our AI SRE dashboard, for example, inside of the product, if you go to that page, the whole point of it is about making you get a sense of what systems you're connecting to. So we'll connect to your GitHub or your GitLab, we'll connect to your Grafana or your Datadog. We'll also load up certain Slack channels if you opt in. There's a ton of stuff that we end up pulling in and analyzing and crunching so that we can actually use it in the incident. But all of this stuff has a cost. So like you can imagine, we've had sometimes people will sign up like a Slack channel, like they want to use it for the interesting message feature, which is where if someone's in your engineering channel and they're like, oh, I'm about to do a risky deploy actually around this area, and then you have an incident that happens half an hour later, we want to surface that message and be like, hey, by the way, like Martha was talking about this thing over here, this seems related. And when they've ended up signing up like an alert-based channel, and we've had their bot in there that's sending like 20 messages a second, and we're indexing all of those through AI, suddenly the cost goes through the roof, right? So yeah, we have to think very carefully about what we're opting in, and particularly about how we actually end up processing these things. And we have to give guidance to customers about what would be the right type of input to put into this system, because the more stuff you put in, the worse it will get in terms of like, if you're putting in junk, then you will tend to get junk out the other side. So you want to avoid that.
Meri, I'd be interested to know how you have gone about communicating cost to the board, to the finance department. What have you needed to get across to win them over?
So we've on the one hand, we're generally very pro AI, and we see that there's a lot of value for our customers and for us internally as well. So I don't have a huge barrier to trying to adopt. But you're right that budgets are a separate thing from enthusiasm. And so we've definitely needed to be able to monitor costs to know whether, you know, using model A or model B is going to be more expensive or less, and those kind of things. A number of these features are sort of internal use only at the moment, so we're using them. Pleo for Pleo is what we call it, where we use our own product and dog food it pretty significantly. And so, to some extent, at the moment, it's been possible to keep that that cost within budget fairly easily, because we're not needing to be as immensely responsive as Incident.io are, for instance, right? So Lawrence and team need to pre-process loads of things so that they can react very quickly when there is something going wrong. It's not, you know, needing a bit of insight on whether you're overpaying for your Atlassian licenses is not something that is quite as time critical as that. And so we're able to, you know, process at the point of information being needed and to advise at the point of that processing happening. And so we don't have quite as like wide-ranging pre-processing need, and that makes things a little bit easier. But we absolutely are into pricing conversations and, you know, what are our different tiers and plans, and how do we account for, you know, overuse in some ways, and that kind of stuff as well. So I think as long as it provides customer value and customers are willing to pay for that value, the sort of fundamental conversation is okay, but the specifics are quite difficult, and you get into lots of like FinOps and being able to monitor and alert on these things well. And you know, for a while I was getting emails every day that we had hit our self-imposed limit on OpenAI and those kind of things, and I was like, okay, this coming to my inbox is possibly not the best way for us to be controlling this, folks. Let's find a better way to do that.
We have an AI cost pulse channel where we drop in a graph of the last 7 days split across all the projects that we use on all the providers, and it just comes in at 9 a.m. and there's a big spike. We'll drop someone on the team on it and we'll go dig into it and make sure it doesn't happen again, which works quite effectively, actually.
I agree very much, I think, with the guys that it all comes down to kind of how real time actually kind of the outputs of the system you're using, because I think kind of incident, right? For example, the more kind of real time there is and the more data you need to collect to be able to resolve with SAP, obviously the more expensive it gets. I think that the systems where you can kind of analyze it like off the loop, or maybe even not in production sometimes, but just like as a separate kind of replica database and just kind of run a separate kind of AI classification. I think that's exactly where AI kind of is applicable best. Can be cheaper and actually can be even better quality. So I think that kind of using for this on the kind of 2x2 matrix of like how much real time or kind of just of the system that is, and effectively kind of how much the typical classification problem where AI fits best versus kind of everything else. I think the more you can use AI kind of in that bucket of like of real time and just typical classification, especially kind of problems and others, I think the better you are as a business. I mean, better off you are as a business.
We're all very much in an R&D stage as well at this point, honestly. Like you first make it work and then you make it fast, right? And like I think, for example, at the moment, if we're ever in a situation where we're building our new feature, we're using the larger models by default because you would, and it's only when you are happy with the feature and you have evals around it and you can measure it, that's when you start bringing in like, oh, well, what happens if we switch this thing out for a smaller model? What's the cost optimization that you can do there? But you also have this weird thing as well where like the cost is just extremely, like in these agentic systems, they can simply just choose to do more work and that will drive up the cost as well. So like it's very hard to do modeling, for example, of how in our incidents we have a suggestion engine which will come in at a certain point and go, hey, I've seen that you're chatting about this. Here's an incident update I've gone and prepared for you. And we were modeling that out, and like our initial naive thing was going to cost us like several million a year to end up running, and you end up doing the finances for it, and then you look into the code and you start picking it apart. And by the time you're actually quite smart with it, I think we brought it way down. It's like 50,000 or something now yearly to try and run the thing. But you just have to get quite clever with how you're tuning the system and doing like mathematical predictions and modeling around how it will kick in and how much it will cost every time it does. But yeah, it's quite complicated.
Just a reminder to viewers at home, if you want to submit a question, just fire it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll come to the most popular ones. I want to move on and talk a little bit about building out a compliance team. What are the early stage hires that are needed? What are the first hires, Dan, that you made when you were looking to build this out?
A founder, a CTO. A true and the only realistic answer I think that you can have as an early stage company. No, I think seriously, kind of, I think that we haven't gone kind of that deep down on that yet, because again, I think that it's all about kind of application use case, and I think it's all about just properly, in a way, kind of documenting again. I think what I described in the very beginning, where you use it, how you use it, and then quite predeterministic kind of inputs and outputs. That would be kind of more than sufficient to kind of to kind of use it. So hence, I think that kind of you can do a lot of it with like very few people. I don't think that kind of you need to think about it necessarily that I'm using it now, hence let me have an army of people. Like first off, a lot of like triangulation of these data sources you can do just like automatically as well, number one. And number two, the more you feed that back to the users, kind of the easier it makes for yourself, because like if your users are really kind of passionate about your product and can kind of in some good way effectively accept some mistakes that you're having, then this would be the natural feedback loop that gives you kind of the product reassurance in a way. Kind of obviously put aside that you need to be compliant with like a EU Data Act and like obviously GDPR and lots of other things, that goes without saying. But that just, I think that needs to be a red tape need to be put there, and it has to be safeguarded separately of the application of AI. So I think that there just needs to be kind of a bit of a Chinese walls built between them. And it's not different as to kind of pre-AI era of designing products. You had to have it before as well. So this part is not kind of changed, but I think kind of AI application can be done very lean in reality.
Faisal, what are the early stage hires that you're noticing startups making in their compliance departments?
Yeah, I'm noticing a lot of what Dan said. So when we think about having really technical leads, whether that's the CTO or the co-founder, maybe it's head of specific AI divisions or AI engineering departments, but really having that technical expertise to understand how some of these AI systems work, with dedicated teams focused on AI initiatives. Whether that's internal use of AI or if it's the development of the product and operations. But then I do also think you see like that same on the governance risk compliance side, GRC. When we think about having focused team members on those aspects, where one person on that side or a team of those individuals not only can help address programs from a security and privacy perspective, but when we start to get into integrity discipline, staying on top of regulations, what's coming out in the market, staying on top of industry trends and where the world is going. I think that that's also very critical context, as also what Dan mentioned, right? Because you have to start layering in, hey, like now there are these rules and these rules apply in these ways. Are we even doing these ways? Where it becomes a collaborative effort when we think about the functional and the technical coming together to understand, is what we're doing okay with the regulations and these standards, or do we need to adjust specific things based off of our operations today?
Meri, how have you thought about building out a compliance team specifically around your AI systems? Have you upskilled employees? Have you hired externally? What have you looked to do?
Sort of a mix of things. So given we're financially regulated by the FCA in the UK and the FSA in Denmark, we already have an expectation on us to have what's called the 3 lines of defense. So you have your first line of defense is your operations, so people on the ground being well versed in the regulatory and legal and and other GDPR etc. requirements. You then have the second line of defense is the sort of watchers. So people overseeing that, they act as a challenge function and make sure that they, ensure that you're doing things right, that you understand what's needed. They'll often write a sort of official opinion about a product development that you're doing, or similar to make sure that you can demonstrate that you've appropriately challenged to make sure that you stay in line. And then the third line of defense is the sort of who watches the watchers, so internal audit or external audit. And so we're in a situation, being a fintech, that we've already got a much greater sort of structure around compliance and regulation than most places have. We found that adding the capacity in the first line was relatively easy because, you know, we need engineers on the ground and product people and designers and so on to be quite conversant with those expectations anyway. But our second line of defense, which tends to be risk and compliance professionals, they have needed to, you know, to understand a bit more. We've invested in some extra data privacy kind of expertise in our legal team and that kind of stuff as well. And I think that when we get to external audit, I think we're going to see a set of auditors emerge in the market who are particularly specialist in AI and how you govern it effectively. We're seeing some evidence of that already, but I think it's going to become more and more the case as people start using this more and more.
Meri, can I have a question? I'm just curious because I think that naturally, I think as it always happens, whenever you kind of start splitting up some responsibilities, you effectively kind of take off some control, and I think that kind of make people in a way a bit less kind of standalone and less kind of self-sufficient to be run in order to kind of deliver things end to end, right? I think it's the kind of typical debate that some people are having, like, I don't know, should engineers do kind of QA themselves, or should there be a separate kind of QA team, for example? So kind of, obviously, whenever you're getting to scale, you need to have like compliance, you need to have separate regulation. If you're going public, obviously, you need to have separate teams working on that. But whenever you're small, kind of, when is the right time to start breaking it up? Because the only moment you separate it, the exact same moment, it becomes someone else's problem. And then kind of, I think people stop having kind of end-to-end view, kind of responsibility, ownership type mindset. So how not to break it kind of too early on?
I think there's a cultural element where you want it to be, rather than shared responsibility, double responsibility is how we talk about it. So you don't want it to be single accountability, you want it to be double accountability, not shared accountability. And I think that's the model that we've tried to use. I think how early you need to do it depends a lot on what industry you're in and what regulation you fall under. You know, when I was at Monzo in relatively early days, just after the banking license and the operationalization happened, we needed to have evidence that we had those three lines of defense from that moment on, from becoming a bank. And it's pretty much the best practice for fintechs to follow that model that banks are legally required, I believe, to have, or certainly expected to have. And so I think if you set it up right, it doesn't diminish that sense of ownership. It can accentuate it. It gives you somebody who's going to help you own it better by asking you difficult questions and making sure that you're on top of things. And I think that's what really good governance looks like, is that it's additive. It's not diminishing or what's the right word? Diluting ownership. It's actually making it better if you do it right. But I think you absolutely have to work on the cultural side of that as well as the mechanics of it, because as you say, you don't want a situation where people feel like they're throwing something over the wall and risk is somebody else's thing to manage. You absolutely have to have your first line really feeling that accountability for the management of the risk. And in fintechs, that tends to be that sort of risk-based approach of having choices to make and making active choices about how risky you do and what don't want to go, which for us is actually set at a board level. So we have a risk appetite for certain things, and our risk appetite for, you know, not complying with GDPR is extremely low. We'd never do anything that was not complying with legal requirement or regulatory requirement. But on certain commercial things, we might be willing to take more of a risk. And I think that's the interesting part. But in terms of like how early is too early, I'm not sure there's a point that's too early. I think a lot of people end up with governance debt, the same way that we end up with technical debt, and it can pile up really rapidly and be very, very challenging to undo if you don't invest early enough. But I appreciate that that's quite a tough thing to hear for small teams that aren't thinking that somebody for, you know, risk and compliance is high on the list of who they need to deliver. But I think in this new world, a lot of us need that help much earlier than we would have done in the past. Faisal, I can see you've come off mute. So
Yeah, no, I want to plus one everything you said, Meri. I think I also, and it might be going slightly like a different direction here in what my emphasis is going to be, but if I think about some of the concepts in cybersecurity, even data privacy and integrity, you think about asset management, you think about having a good idea of data governance and having a broader data governance program and ownership around that. A lot of these domains that you build programs around, whether it's security, privacy, or AI focused, they're very crucial to have a good foundation for upfront. Where I think at the start, when you're starting your organization, using an industry standard framework, whether it's 40,001, if you want to look at some of the requirements that EU AI Act has, you'll go build your governance to start, go for it. You may consider using a management system standard like ISO. But the point in here is you take that structure and you start to build that structure to be really, really good and foundational earlier on, where it's very possible that one person in a startup of 5 or 10 is really responsible for this, and this, right? Like different parts of your asset management, your data management, your system management life cycles. But then as you scale the organization, as you grow, and to your point, there's not really a good like indicator of like, hey, when should you start to like kind of peel back the onion and shift responsibilities out? But it starts to become a, hey, as long as you have a really good foundation for how you think about ownership of data in your organization, for example, if I'm going to feed for an internal AI system specific information about the product, maybe it's the roadmap, maybe it's different components of how my system works. Not only should there be this, hey, this AI system can now use it to go in and do some level of processing, but there needs to be an accountability aspect to the individual folks responsible for maintaining that content. And then knowing where it goes, kind of an emphasis of data lineage, right? Data provenance, data lineage. And I think that's a really big concept and that's getting emphasized as a part of this boom of AI is just having effective processes in place, a lot of which may not get a lot of emphasis in cybersecurity, right? When we think about good asset inventories and good data inventories, it's a really tough thing to do when you think about actually putting pen to paper and documenting specific data components, how you categorize them, the specific systems. Not saying it's impossible. It's just, it's difficult to do. And it's very like, I think it's very crucial to get ahead of the very first thing you do when you're building a program.
One thing that I will add on that is so we're not that big as a company. We're a touch over 100 people. Over the last year, I mean, I've done this a lot before as the technical person, like principal SRE at larger companies before. But the AI element of data privacy and governance has been something that I've been kind of like the person taking point on, or at least the person that our legal team come to whenever they're trying to refine what this actually means when we're saying these things to customers. And I'd like to underscore that, like, if you are a smaller team, one of the best things that you can do is figure out what your policy is on how you're using AI inside of your product so that you can communicate it really well externally to your customers. So like we have on our trust portal how we think about AI, how that comes under all of the other regulatory frameworks that we're within. So like GDPR and other US based or the US based like data governance aspects of things. And as soon as you can do that, you can start pointing at a doc that goes, this is actually how we do things, and using that as a shared understanding of how you as a company are going about building these AI products or using AI internally. And I think increasingly you're going to have, if you are a company that is serving other companies, you're going to have your customers asking you for what your policy is for this stuff. So just writing it down is the best first step you can do, even in advance of you hiring in anyone who's particularly specialist.
100%. Yeah, having a really good AI policy is crucial. And also, like, just adding on to that, right? It's also not just good for how you handle data that you're getting as a service offering, but it comes back to Meri's point on a culture, right? How do you promote a culture within the organization about AI responsibilities and these AI concepts? Very similar to how we might approach security culture, privacy culture, and things like that. This is just really it's a different domain, different risks, and there's different responsibilities and things to look out for as part of everyday use, where you might have different ways of communicating that, policies. Maybe it's moments on your all hands that talk about cybersecurity, AI, things like that, where you're actively promoting this culture of what is the right way to use these systems and what is safe, what is not acceptable, tying it into principles like acceptable use and things like that.
Yeah, I think it'll be really good to look a little bit to the future now, and discuss how you go about future-proofing these governance systems, because it's such a fast-moving technology. Things could look completely different in the next couple of years. They almost certainly will have moved along unimaginably so. Lawrence, how do you future-proof these systems? What are you guys doing at Incident to mitigate against that?
Yeah, so I think first I want to just reiterate that everyone is in the like R&D phase now, whether or not you're building AI into your product or you're using it internally. So we're very much in the like let a thousand flowers bloom sort of thing at the moment. I think all these companies are trying all these different tools and they're finding out what works and what doesn't. The best thing that you can do, or that I found anyway over the last like year or two that I've been working with this, is just having like a regular reassessment, maybe every 3 months, on actually how has the industry changed? What do I think is now how it will look in 6-12 months from now? And how has my opinion changed between the point that I'm saying this now and the last 3 months? Because honestly, the level of ambition that we've had, for example, using AI in the product, has been materially different every single time we've come to those 3 months. And it goes again for how you're using AI tools internally. So the only thing that I like, or some of the only things that I can almost be assured of, is that these AI tools are only going to become more pervasive. The amount of data that they get access to will just increase, and the amount of connectivity between these systems is going to increase like tenfold over the next year. So trying to put up the guardrails so that you understand where your data is going, how you're using it, and like what is safe or dangerous, and what parts of the system shouldn't be able to speak to other parts of the system is going to be really, really important. Otherwise, we will end up in the future where all of your systems can talk to each other, and you may find actually that that's maybe not what you wanted. And if that happens too soon, you might end up regretting the mess that you've gone and made.
Meri, how are you future-proofing?
I think we're a little behind where Lawrence and his team are, if I'm really honest. So I think we're still in that very early stage of figuring out what we want to do and how we measure it even. So the kind of eval type approach of going, how do you know when the model gets upgraded that things are still going to work okay, and all of that kind of stuff is still something that we're really investing in. And so I think we're still at the point of going, when the change happens underneath us, how do we make sure that we know what that change looked like, and what the impact on our customers might be if the feature doesn't work quite the same way that it did in the previous version of the model, or that kind of thing. And so we're doing a lot of looking outside, looking at I help run the lead dev conference, and at LDX3 there were some really great talks from like Gogea Ross and from Birgitte Buchler from ThoughtWorks about the state of the art in terms of AI coding for our internal use, and we're trying to learn a lot from how people are developing AI features all around the industry. But I think it's absolutely still such a fast moving area that trying to pretend that we know what it's going to look like a year from now is really, really not sensible. I talk to my team a lot about like being ready for change, and you can't hold back the ocean, but you can learn to surf, is the phrase we tend to use. And so I think of it more like we're waxing our boards and checking the weather forecast regularly, but we're not pretending that we can control the ocean either.
Dan, how are you looking to future-proof things at Dwelly?
Oh wow! I mean, I've been looking forward to this question because I think that we are kind of to some extent behind on some other things, even more fundamental ones. So I think that kind of on this one, it's a bit harder. I mean, not much to share probably, rather than just some basics, right? I think that quite important things here is obviously kind of versioning and kind of understanding again models, data sets, prompts, versioning, kind of everything, so that you have like proper audits, kind of debugging, etc., number one. I think that kind of making sure that you think about kind of how potentially you can kind of move it if it would be needed, like portability, vendors, kind of dependency to some extent? Can you kind of quite easily move the things in case if you need it, switching from one kind of foundational model to the other, or using few kind of at the same time? I think that kind of these are the things that we rather kind of set up for from the beginning, but probably kind of, if not the just providing pure theory, but talking about practical things, for now, that's pretty much it, I would say.
Faisal, what key upcoming regulatory changes could impact European startups? What are you advising startups to just be aware of at the moment?
Yeah. I think as common regulation I've referenced in the session, the EU AI Act, it's effect now, but the specific parts of the regulation are kind of roll in effect. They're phased approach. They come effective dates are kind of over different parts over the timeline. When I think about getting ahead of regulations, not only the regulations that are up and coming, but also other AI disciplines, I kind of first start the conversation with, hey, look, you have data privacy regulations today as just as an example, where GDPR, really robust data privacy regulation. And the disciplines that you put in here as to comply with GDPR should generally overlap to other data privacy regulations. It's really the scope of the data that mostly differs. Not saying some requirements aren't different, just it mainly becomes like, what are you doing with the data and what data are you getting to begin with from a jurisdiction perspective? So when you look at it from that lens and you think about, okay, hey, these the upcoming European regulations, number one is, what is the EU AI Act's requirements and how are they applicable to you? What risk level are you? Are you a high risk vendor? Are you doing a prohibited practice? And getting really crisp of what that letter of the law is. But then, like, how do you build a program around it to operationalize some of those requirements? And that's layering in things like ISO 42001. 42001 has a really good governance structure when we think about AI management systems, not just how you as service providers and the controls that you need to have in place for it, but then also how you manage an AI internally for yourselves and the operations from an internal AI use. So you can start to build governance and layer in these components from the regulation and set those really good foundations for yourself. Now, like, lastly, not even talking specific frameworks, I kind of want to bring this back to the concepts that we talked about around data provenance and data management, data lineage. GDPR has this article, or I think it's Article 30, could be getting that number wrong, but it's about records of processing activities. I think all of us may be aware of it in some way, shape, or form. The ROPA. And obviously, like, doing Europa it's a lot, like it's a lengthy exercise, but it like hits my like home for me when I think about like what it's trying to do and ensure that organizations have visibility to for themselves. It's really understanding their processing activities, the flow of data within it, and really the intention behind the data. And that concept is really important in the AI space, and well, in my opinion, right? It's being very intentional about where you use AI, what data you're plugging into these systems, where if you have a really good backbone of that records of processing activities and layering in some of those AI disciplines and where data goes from an AI system perspective, I think you start to see sort of this parallel coverage across various frameworks at that point in time too.
Is
Okay,
there a view in the world that kind of national resilience topic, and every country should have its own kind of foundational model and everything, that kind of some countries would start mandating using specific models at some point of time to protect the data? Like, hey, you guys in Europe use Mistral type thing. Faisal, is it possible, or
Yeah.
Moonshot?
You know, I would say that anything is possible, but I usually like to use history as at least something to inform what the future might hold. So I think like how we've seen with the US versus the EU. In the US, is like we've started to see US state privacy regulations across the board as this example. It started with CCPA, it started with GDPR in the EU, but then it's kind of proliferated where each state is starting to come out with their own state privacy regulations. You actually also see that on the AI front too, right? Like each state's coming out with their AI focused regulations and acts. So I think that it's going to be a growing effort. Could it happen? Maybe. But I think we'll first see sort of a similar pattern to what we've seen before, which is kind of go micro focused and then become a bit more macro at the top layer.
thanks very much, Faisal. And that is about all we've got time for. So thanks to everyone who joined. Thanks to Meri, Lawrence, Faisal, Dan. Thanks to our partner, Vanta, for their support. And we will see you next time for the next Sifted Talks, where we'll be discussing how to scale global teams with AI and agility. You can head to the link we've dropped into the chat now. Thanks again, and goodbye.